There was a time when everything needed a reason. Not just actions, but moods, choices, pauses, preferences. If you felt tired, there had to be an explanation. If you said no, there had to be justification. If you changed direction, it had to make sense. Not always to others, often to yourself. An ongoing internal accounting. Why am I like this? Why did I do that? What does this say about me? Self-explanation became a way of staying oriented, a way of confirming identity. If you could explain yourself, you could locate yourself. Without explanation, there was a subtle fear of becoming incoherent, even to yourself. But slowly, something begins to loosen. Not the ability to explain, that remains. The need to explain. At first, it shows up in small ways. You do something simple. You choose something small. And the explanation doesn't arrive. Not because it's blocked, it just doesn't appear. You notice the absence. And nothing goes wrong. You don't feel lost. You don't feel confused. You don't feel irresponsible. You just continue. This can feel uncomfortable at first. Self-explanation has long been associated with responsibility. If you don't know why you're doing something, are you being careless? If you don't understand yourself, are you being unaware? But this assumes that explanation precedes action. In lived experience, it rarely does. Most actions arise before words, before reasons, before narratives. You reach for a cup without explanation. You step aside without explanation. You respond to a sound without explanation. The body moves intelligently without commentary. For a long time, self-explanation tried to claim credit for this intelligence. It arrived afterward and said, "This happened because..." But over time, it becomes clear that explanation is often retrospective, not causal. Living without self-explanation doesn't mean living without understanding. It means not requiring understanding in order to function. There's a difference. Understanding becomes optional instead of mandatory, helpful sometimes, absent others. This changes how you relate to yourself. You stop treating yourself like a project that needs continuous clarification. You stop checking in with an internal manager asking, "Are we aligned? Does this fit the plan? Is this still who we are?" That internal manager was built to maintain coherence. But coherence is a mental preference, not a requirement for living. Life itself is allowed to be inconsistent. It's allowed to shift. It's allowed to contradict itself. Self-explanation tried to smooth out those edges, tried to create a clean narrative. But the cost of that narrative was constant tension. You had to keep yourself consistent with a story that was always slightly outdated. Living without self-explanation feels like stepping out of that maintenance role. You're no longer required to explain why you're quieter today, or why something that once mattered doesn't anymore, or why you don't feel like engaging. Those states don't require defense. They don't require context. They're simply what's present. This doesn't mean you stop communicating. You still answer questions. You still offer explanations when they're useful. But you're no longer compelled to provide them preemptively. You don't justify your existence internally before acting. There's a subtle shift from, "I should explain this," to, "This doesn't need explaining." And that shift is deeply relieving, because self-explanation was often tied to self-judgment. If you couldn't explain yourself clearly, you felt uneasy. If your reasons didn't sound good enough, you doubted yourself. Without explanation, there was guilt. Now, without explanation, there's neutrality. Not apathy, neutrality. A sense that things can be as they are without requiring approval. This changes how decisions are made. Before, decisions were evaluated against identity. Is this something I would do? Does this align with my values? Does this make sense for who I am? Those questions aren't wrong, but they were often overused. They slowed movement. They created internal debate where none was needed. Now, decisions arise from context, from situation, from what's needed. You act, and afterward, there's no internal press conference. No explanation issued, no narrative constructed. The action stands on its own. This can feel unsettling at first, because explanation once provided reassurance. It said, "This wasn't random. This fits. This makes sense." Without it, there can be a brief sense of exposure, like standing without a script. But that exposure softens, and what replaces it isn't chaos. It's trust. Trust in responsiveness. Trust in intelligence that doesn't speak. Trust in the fact that you don't need to understand yourself in order to live effectively. This also changes how you relate to your past. Self-explanation loves revisiting. Why did I do that? What was wrong with me then? What does that say about who I was? These questions used to feel important, necessary. But now, the past doesn't require reinterpretation. It doesn't need to be fixed. It doesn't need to be reframed. It happened, and it's done. Without the need for self-explanation, there's less compulsion to extract lessons. Not because learning stops, but because learning doesn't need to be narrated. The body learns. Experience integrates. You don't need to explain the lesson for it to be real. This reduces self-blame. Mistakes no longer require character analysis. You don't ask, "What kind of person does this make me?" You address what's practical. You adjust, and you move on. This doesn't make you careless. It makes you efficient. You stop wasting energy explaining what no longer needs explanation. Emotions shift too. Before, emotions demanded stories. Why am I feeling this way? What triggered this? What does this mean? Sometimes those questions were useful. Often they weren't. They prolonged the emotion. They turned a passing feeling into an identity statement. Now, emotions are allowed to exist without interpretation. Sadness doesn't need a cause. Irritation doesn't need justification. Joy doesn't need explanation. They arise. They pass. And nothing is wrong if they don't make sense. This creates emotional cleanliness. Feelings move through without residue. They don't stick to a narrative. They don't become proof of something larger. They're just part of the moment. Relationships change subtly as well. You stop explaining yourself excessively, not because you're withholding, but because there's nothing to defend. You don't preemptively clarify intentions. You don't over-contextualize preferences. You don't soften every boundary with a story. You say yes or no. You engage or you don't. And that's enough. This doesn't make you cold. It makes you clear. People may notice that you're less reactive, less defensive, less invested in being understood. That can feel strange to them at first, because self-explanation is often used as reassurance for others too. Without it, silence can feel ambiguous. But ambiguity isn't a problem. It's a space where life doesn't need to be defined. Over time, interactions become simpler. There's less negotiation with perception, less concern about how you're coming across. You respond honestly to what's happening rather than managing an image. This doesn't mean misunderstanding disappears. It means misunderstanding is tolerated. You don't rush to correct it. You don't chase clarity for its own sake. If clarification is needed, it happens. If not, it doesn't. This reduces internal pressure. The constant effort to be legible fades. You don't need to narrate your inner world for it to be valid. One of the deepest shifts is how identity loosens. Self-explanation was the glue holding identity together. Each explanation reinforced a sense of continuity. I am this because, I do this because. Without those explanations, identity becomes lighter, less defined, more responsive. You don't have to know who you are today. You can find out through living. And that discovery doesn't need to be verbalized. You don't need to pin it down. You don't need to summarize it. Life expresses itself through action, not explanation. This can feel like losing ground, but it's actually losing unnecessary weight. You're no longer carrying a running commentary about yourself. You're not translating experience into meaning in real time. You're letting experience be primary, and meaning, if it appears, comes later, or not at all. Either way, life functions. There's a quiet dignity in this. You're not constantly justifying your existence. You're not arguing your case internally. You're not trying to make yourself make sense. You simply are, and that is enough. This doesn't mean explanation disappears entirely. When someone asks, you can answer. When reflection is useful, it happens. But explanation is no longer the foundation of living. It's a tool, used occasionally, set down easily, and because it's no longer overused, it becomes clearer when it does appear. It's not tangled with defense or fear. It's simple, direct, functional. The absence of constant self-explanation creates space. Space for spontaneity, space for change, space for not knowing. And not knowing no longer feels like a problem, feels natural, because life was never fully explainable. Self-explanation was an attempt to stabilize what is inherently fluid. Letting go of that attempt brings relief. Not dramatic relief, quiet relief, the kind you feel in your shoulders, in your breathing, in the way you move through a day without narrating it to yourself. You don't need to ask, why am I like this? You don't need to answer it. You don't need to resolve yourself. You live. And living, it turns out, doesn't require explanation. It only requires participation. This is what it's like to live without self-explanation. Not confused, not detached, just unburdened. And from here, something else becomes possible. Action without internal dialogue, which is where we'll go next.